Many of you who've clicked on this video have probably never heard of the term resonance used in the Cosmere, and I don't blame you. It's not a concept that ever appears explicitly in text, and to my knowledge it's only alluded to in the Ars Arcanum for Shadows of Self. However, it is a concept that exists in the Cosmere and has been confirmed via word of Brandon. And while we don't know what exactly this term will be called when it finally gets a name, it is an undeniable fact that those with access to one or more invested arts do have access to these hybrid abilities. To explain what a resonance is in the Cosmere is pretty straightforward. However, understanding why it happens and how it works cosmologically is a bit more complex. And to understand what's going on, we're going to have to talk a bit about rhythms and tones associated with shards, as well as some real-world concepts of harmonics.
This video will contain very few story spoilers, and I'll provide a timestamp for where to skip to if I can't avoid one. I will be sourcing information from The Rhythm of War, Wind and Truth, Mistborn Era 2, Mistborn the Well of Ascension, one page from Elantris, and some words of Brandon.
Additionally, this video is going to contain a lot of speculation on my part. I am going to provide sources for why I think the way I do about how resonance works. You can think of a resonance as a perk, a subtle additional ability that people who have access to multiple invested arts or surges have access to. This is most commonly seen on Roshar, where each Radiant Order has access to an additional ability. We don't know what all of them are, but we have a good idea for some, and a couple have even been confirmed. I'll talk about those later on.
What these abilities are is unknown for most of the Radiant Orders. The two we know for certain are Windrunners and Lightweavers, but there is speculation on a few other Radiant Orders. Windrunner's resonant ability is one of increased connection. They're able to have far more squires per Radiant than any other order. Lightweavers have improved memory related to mnemonic devices, which gives them superhuman powers of recollection. This information can be found in Words of Radiance chapter 49 in the epigraph. It's also speculated that Els Callers might have a supernatural spatial memory, serving as a mental GPS of sorts.
Sanderson has said that this concept is inspired by constructive interference, a concept that applies to all waves, be it light, sound, radio, but for the sake of demonstration, we're going to be considering it in terms of sound waves.
I was wondering, with resonance,
Yes.
is that a sort of constructive interference?
Constructive? No. Resonance is more about the way it's more of a natural interference.
So what I mean, like, you have two waves, right? And if they're troughs...
Oh, okay. Is that the formal term for
constructive
the constructive interference? Oh, constructive. I thought you were So yes, I would say that is an accurate phrase. I mean, it's obviously not exactly the same thing. But yeah, I mean, that's what I was looking at when I was building it, was kind of things like this with waveform patterns and whatnot. So yeah. So yes, at least it was inspired by this kind of idea.
Constructive interference occurs when the peaks and the troughs of two waves line up. This is a practical increase of the energy of the wave, resulting in a larger amplitude. In terms of sound, this makes a louder sound because there's more energy associated with this wave. For a practical example of two waves with the same amplitude, we have these tuning forks here. They both are the same frequency, and when I play them together, they'll be louder. Not because I am hitting one harder than the other, but because there's two playing at once. It's really, really intuitive, right? Like, if two things are playing at the same time, it's going to be louder, but nonetheless, this is an example of an increased amplitude on a wave. This is also a good example of resonance. I hit one tuning fork and I don't hit this one, but this one still makes a sound because the sound wave from this one resonates with the same frequency that this one does. Applying this concept to radiant surges, it's clear that something doesn't quite add up. If it were just straight constructive interference, you'd think that the abilities would manifest as a stronger power and not a tertiary third ability that we see resonance abilities have in the Cosmere. Does this mean that all investiture in the Cosmere has a wave associated with it? Yes. All investiture lets off an audible tone and rhythm. However, not everyone is able to hear it. Sometimes it requires a special ability, or simply at being a certain species allows you to hear these rhythms and tones. These tones that investiture gives off are referred to as pure tones, and each shard has a specific tone and rhythm associated with it.
Is there a quantum of investiture? Just as how the proton, the quantum of light, is the force carrier particle of electromagnetism, is there a force carrier particle for investiture, and do you have a name for it? My follow-up question would involve string theory, but I'll leave that one for later. Yes, there is a quantum of investiture, though it acts very oddly in the Cosmere. True investiture is a purely spiritual realm thing. In the Cosmere, there are two alternate planes of existence with their own specific laws. Some of them, as you've undoubtedly noticed, behave similar to ideas of string theory.
Before moving on, we need to understand what a tone is and how it's different from what a pure tone is in the Cosmere. To help me demonstrate this, I'm going to have my friends here play a note for us. The note they just played is B flat, and one note on its own isn't enough to create constructive interference. What we heard here was a single note, which is actually a bunch of different frequencies layered on top of each other. But if we play a bunch of different notes at the same time, something incredible might happen. What you just heard was a special type of constructive interference called an overtone. Despite only having 4 members of a band here and only 4 notes being played, it's possible to hear a very quiet 5th note, if you're listening very carefully. This is what I think is going on with resonance. Each shard has a pure tone, and each use of magic is a different note within that tone. For example, if we have the band here play a B flat, they're all going to be playing the same note, but the wavelengths inside those tones are going to be different. Let's suppose that this is a pure tone. This together, all of them playing at once, is one shardic tone. But if we just have one person playing, that's kind of like using an invested art. It's just one portion of the full tone being played.
If these notes are produced by a spirit web with access to those specific powers, their abilities resonate, creating an overtone ability through constructive interference. The musical analogy goes even further. Basically, when these two abilities create an overtone through constructive interference, I see that overtone resonating with the spiritual ideal of another power, giving them access to a resonant ability.
An audible overtone is usually quite weak, difficult to hear. But that tracks with what we know about resonance abilities in the Cosmere. They're usually smaller scale or weaker abilities than the surges that are associated with them. For example, Windrunners have access to gravitation and adhesion, and their ability is that they have access to more squires. It doesn't necessarily power them up, but it does give them an additional perk.
These tones associated with shards also come with an accompanying rhythm. Honor's rhythm has been described as stately, and the slight flicker of stormlight and gemstones is set to Honor's rhythm. "You can hear the light?" Navani said. Raboniel hummed, then thought to nod her response. She held up a diamond, crystalline and pure, filled with stormlight from the high storm the day before. You have to concentrate to know what you're seeking to hear it from the sphere, a pure tone, extremely soft. Navani hit the proper tuning fork, letting the tone ring in the room. Raboniel nodded. Yes, that is it. Exactly the same, only... Navani sat up. Only? A sphere's tone has a rhythm to it. Raboniel explained, eyes closed as she held the sphere. Each light has a rhythm. Honor's is stately, Cultivation's is stark and staccato, but builds. Cultivation's has been described as wild in building, and Odium's is chaotic but with a certain logic to it. These rhythms are beats made with the tone of that shard, meaning the same tone is being played, but the actual duration of the note changes. These rhythms and tones are also influenced by the shard's intent and perception thereof.
Another interesting quirk about thinking of the Cosmere in this way, in terms of music, is that it explains allomantic pulses.
When someone uses bronze in allomancy, the Mistborn or Misting is able to detect different beats or rhythms that are described as pulses in world. We also know that Twinborn can have resonant abilities, but it's weaker than those seen on Roshar. It's possible on Scadrial to be born with the ability to access both allomancy and feruchemy. This has been of specific interest to me lately, as the mixing of different types of investiture has curious effects. One needs only to look at what happened on Roshar to find this manifested. Two powers, combined, often have an almost chemical reaction. Instead of getting out exactly what you put in, you get something new. On Scadrial, someone with one allomantic power and one feruchemical power is called Twinborn. The effects here are more subtle than they are when mixing surges on Roshar, but I am convinced that each unique combination also creates something distinctive. Not just two powers, you could say, but two powers, and an effect. This demands further study. A possible example of this is Waxilium's two abilities in resonance. As a coin shot and a skimmer, he has access to a unique third ability to generate steel bubbles, or he can steel push in a small area around him absent of a target at times. We also know that the pulses heard emanating from the Well of Ascension is a pure tone of Scadrial. Is the wells pulsing a pure tone of Scadrial? Yup. All of this together leads me to believe that all allomancy produces the tone of preservation when used. However, the type of metal burned slightly offsets the frequency of the wave. And what do I mean by this? Well, let's take a look at a wave. When a note is played, it looks like this. But if the frequency is slightly offset to what we call out of tune, it produces audible beats.
These two notes are still technically musically the same. However, their frequencies and pitch are off just enough that they produce audible beats. My thinking is that any use of allomancy produces preservation's tone. However, the different metals are slightly off pitch from preservation's pure tone, producing these audible beats that can be detected by seekers. By this logic, Lerasium would produce preservation's pure tone and harmonize that person's soul with preservation's pure tone, turning them into a Mistborn, which is what we've seen in the books.
Further evidence of this concept is alluded to in Elantris. When Raoden is reading texts on how Aeon Door functions, he notes that scholars indicate that pulse length and frequency are important when shaping and constructing channels for the door to flow through. He began to grasp the theory of Aeon Door. The door was as Galadon had described it, a powerful reservoir just beyond the normal senses. Its only desire was to escape. The books explain that the door existed in a place that was full of pressure, and so the energy pushed its way through any viable exit, moving from an area of high concentration to one of low. However, because of the door's nature, it could enter the physical world only through gates of the proper size and shape. Elantrians could create rifts with their drawings, providing a means for the door to escape, and those drawings would determine what form the energy took when it appeared. However, if even one line was of the wrong proportion, the door would be unable to enter, like a square trying to force its way through a round hole. Some theorists describe the process using unfamiliar words like frequency and pulse length. Raoden was only beginning to understand how much scientific genius was held in the library's musty pages. How this works practically with Aeon Door is unknown for now, but I hope we learn more in the eventual Elantris sequels. The rhythms heard by the singers on Roshar seem to be a different phenomenon than the rhythms associated with shards. They are a Cosmere-wide phenomenon and are present everywhere, although the planet of Roshar itself seems to magnify them.
Perhaps these have to do with the power of creation, and were left behind by Adonalsium when he created the Cosmere. We know from Wind and Truth that shardic creation can be interpreted as shards working in harmony and creating a new song together.
These shardic tones can harmonize, create a new rhythm and tone. We've seen a few examples of this recently in the Cosmere. Warlight, the harmony of Odium and Honor's Light, pulses with a violent but steady rhythm called the Rhythm of War. Tower Light is a combination of Honor and Cultivation's Light, and is a rhythm of boundless energy and structure that is called the Rhythm of the Tower. A combination of Cultivation and Odium's rhythm has been mentioned once, but not named.
Any of the shards could theoretically harmonize and produce a new rhythm and tone, combining into a new hybrid shard. And presumably this is because they were at one point all part of one being in perfect harmony, that being Adonalsium. But what if these tones aren't in harmony? What if they're a little discordant, if you're picking up what I'm putting down? Anyway, that is the opposite of the concept that we were talking about earlier. Instead of constructive interference, we have something called destructive interference. The next section will contain spoilers for Rhythm of War, so if you don't want those spoilers, I would suggest you skip to this timestamp right here.
Anti-light is a peculiar thing. Initially, it's described as Investiture given a new tone and polarity. Let's use Stormlight as an example. Normal Stormlight is keyed to Honor's power and resonates with their tone.
For the sake of demonstration, let's imagine it looks like this. This is Stormlight and Anti-Stormlight in this example. So what happens when they overlap? Well, the peaks of Stormlight and the troughs of Anti-Stormlight line up, canceling each other out, resulting in nothing, in silence. This is what's going on with Stormlight and Anti-Stormlight, or light and anti-light for that matter. They are the same tone, the same waveform, just offset in such a way that they cancel each other out. This is an example of destructive interference, the opposite of constructive interference, which we talked about earlier. In this example, instead of adding more energy to a wave, the peaks and troughs cancel each other out, resulting in silence.
In this regard, anti-investiture is not the opposite of normal investiture. It's the same thing, just at a different frequency or charge, which I suppose is what antimatter is to normal matter. To draw on another physics analogy, in Rhythm of War, we were led to believe that the interaction of these two lights was explosively violent in nature, that they annihilate each other like antimatter and matter do. Instead, when the lights aren't confined to something like a gemstone where the pressure builds up, what seems to happen is that they kind of just burn each other away. While this is still violent and sad, it's a less gruesome result than what I had imagined. When an invested being is attacked using anti-light, they don't explode. The part of them that was invested burns away.
So what can we take away from all this? Resonance is more than just a cool little bonus ability or perk for characters in the Cosmere. It's a window into the very nature of investiture, of rhythms and tones. It shows us how the Cosmere is working on a fundamental level. It ties together the real-world concept of harmonics into the world building, showing us a deeper level to the logic and intricacies behind these magic systems. Even the most mystical elements of the Cosmere have a deep logical through line. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and share it with your friends who love the Cosmere. And if you want to see more cool Cosmere content like this and support the channel, consider becoming a channel member or a patron. Patreon is now live, and there'll be a link in the description. And thank you to my friends who came out to help me illustrate some of these concepts. And huge thank you to Dennis for supporting the channel, as well as all the other channel members that have already joined. Again, thank you so much for watching. Have an excellent time of day, and I'll catch you all next time. All right, guys. Bye.